Okay, we are online, I think, right? Yeah.
Live, yeah.
Okay. So, good afternoon. This is the second webinar for the Data-Informed Teaching and Learning MOOC by the Agile EDU project. So in the previous webinar, we had one last week, we talked about teachers' data use in a classroom, focusing on data literacy and teacher inquiry. But for this one, we wanted to address the role of school leaders and the larger group of school stakeholders. And therefore, we will also include today, hopefully, the meso level of data use for education. And I'm very happy that Kim Schildkamp and Cindy Poortman have accepted our invitation to talk about this topic today. Cindy and Kim have been working on this topic with schools for many years now. So I'm very happy to have them to join us today. To give a very brief introduction, because I don't want to take much time, to say Cindy Poortman is an associate professor at the University of Twente and a visiting professor at the University of Inland Norway. In her research, she focuses on professional learning communities and networks for professional development. And we also have Kim Schildkamp, who is full professor also at the University of Twente in the city of Enschede, and she is chair of the Department of Teacher Development. In her research, she focuses on data-informed decision-making, including the use of AI in education. So before I give the floor to Kim and Cindy, I just want to remind you, I posted a poll because I was curious to know how many school leaders and teachers we have among us. So if our participants see that in the chat, please respond. I'm curious to see if we have any school leaders among us today, because we wanted to also address school leaders as well as teachers here. And at the end of the presentations, we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So if participants, you are curious to know something, if there's something in mind you want to ask Kim and Cindy, you can post it in the chat, and my colleague Milena and I will have an eye on that. All right, so Kim and Cindy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's our pleasure to be here and to talk about one of our favorite topics, which is, of course, data use. So we have a couple of things that we would like to discuss today. We would like to start off with a little bit of theory because we think that's important also for practice. Next, we want to go specifically into the data team intervention, because if you know the theory, then how could it work in practice? And the data team intervention is one of the ways you could use data in your schools. And thirdly, we want to talk a little bit about the research that we have been doing into data use and data teams over the last 16 years. And I'm hoping I'm not scaring people away with a little bit of theory, because I do want to start with a little bit of theory, but let me start in a very practical manner. Because what we often see in schools that we work with, and I have to admit, including at our own university, is we identify a problem and then we immediately implement a solution. So, for example, in a school, there is low student achievement in mathematics. And then what you often see in schools, that they increase the number of hours that is spent on mathematics, and or that expensive new curriculum materials are bought. However, if we do not know what the causes are of our problem, we don't know if these solutions will actually work. And this is why we need data, because first we need to look at data to what extent we are reaching our goals, and if not, what are the causes of these problems. So we were talking about how important it is that you first use data to examine why students are achieving poorly on mathematics before you can implement actions that actually work. And this is why the data use theory of action comes into play, because although Cindy and myself, we love data, but we also think that data use in schools should not start with data, but with a clear purpose and goals. So what are the goals that you have for your school, at the school level, at the classroom, and even at the individual student level? And after you establish that, then you can collect data on this. Now, often data use is associated with accountability, and often even in a more negative manner. For example, we use data to shame and blame certain schools or teachers that are underperforming. Another side effect is that if we focus only on accountability indicators, that leads to very narrow curricula and short-term goals only related to those accountability indicators. Often accountability is also associated with only test scores, but I think we can all agree that children are more than just test scores. However, always when I talk about accountability, it almost sounds like I'm against accountability, which I'm not. I think accountability is also very important because it has a very clear purpose. Schools are accountable to the society, to parents, and to the children. And accountability is often a really nice starting point for data use, because certain accountability indicators can reveal aspects that need improvement, and that could be a really nice start for a data use process. And one of my favorite quotes is by Lorna Earle and Stephen Katz. Accountability without improvement is empty rhetoric, and improvement without accountability is whimsical action without direction. And to me, this quote demonstrates very nicely that data use can be used for both purposes. But the most important purpose is, of course, school improvement. And as I already said, I always say when I talk about data use, if there's only one thing that you can remember from this entire webinar, is please take with you that data use doesn't start with data, but starts with your goals. And you need to make those very concrete and measurable. And one of the things that I find very interesting in our work with schools, when we talk about these goals and when we ask the question, how do you define quality? When are you happy? It often remains silent. So it's a very difficult question, but it's a very important question to answer. You have to have a vision on quality. You have to have goals before you can start using data, because then you can also compare your current situation and compare that to the goals that you've set for your desired situation. And also very important here is that data use is often associated with achievement, but hopefully our schools work on more than just achievement, and data use can serve many different goals, including equity, well-being, safety, health, and so on. However, this whole goal setting process is not very easy, because if you include different stakeholders, different people might have different ideas about the goals that are feasible. School leaders might have different ideas than teachers. Students, again, might have different ideas as well. And then parents, and it's really important to engage in a dialogue about those goals. So the next step in our theory of action is data, because once you've set a purpose and determined your goals, you can collect data to see how you're doing on those goals. And you can also collect data if you're not achieving those goals to find out why you're not achieving those goals. Now, data is defined as any type of systematically collected information on the school. And we often tend to pretend that data are very, there's bias in humans, but data are very objective. However, it's very important to remember that data are also socially constructed. If it's achievement scores, somebody developed the items on the assessment. If it's a survey, somebody developed the survey items. And when you fill it out, you also have your own biases in there. So it's really important that bias exists in humans, but also bias exists in data. So it's always important to check the quality of the data that you work with. A very famous saying is garbage in, garbage out. Low quality data leads to low quality decision making. So check the quality of the data that you would like to use. Also, what we see in schools is when you talk about data use, we tend to use the data that we already have available. However, it's really important to keep on linking the data that you have to the goals that you have. For example, when I was in primary school, digital literacy was not a very important goal. I was very happy with my tape recorder. I did not have any computers in my classroom, so digital literacy was not a goal, so there were no data on digital literacy. I think we can all agree that digital literacy is a very important goal for schools in our current society, which also implies that we need to collect data on digital literacy. Moreover, another misconception that I would like to raise here is that data are often associated with achievement scores, assessments, numbers, but there are also qualitative data that could be very useful in a whole school improvement process. For example, think about interviews with students. Think about observations in the classroom. These can be very powerful sources of data. And also data from internal and external evaluations. And I specifically want to point you to the importance of student voice data. And I know in this project, there is a lot of attention to the role of students to include them in the data use process. And I just want to emphasize that that is really important. And finally, it's important not to rely on one single source of data, but to rely on multiple sources of data, what we call triangulation. And then when we move to the next step, we've collected our data and we have to turn that data into information and knowledge. And this is a sense-making process, and it's not straightforward or exclusively rational. People have their own lenses and experiences and intuition that comes into play. For example, if I would ask the audience here on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy would you be with a 6? Several people would say, well, 6 is okay, it's more than half. Others would say, well, 6 is kind of low, can it be higher? So it's the same number, but it has different meanings to different people. And it's also confirmation bias that also plays a role here. We tend to cherry pick the data that matches our pre-existing beliefs. What makes it even more complex is that learning is influenced by many different factors. And I think it's important that we see data as a form of feedback, as pieces of a puzzle that we need to put together, but we need to combine it with the expertise that is available in schools and engage in collective sense-making and dialogue, where you combine the data that you've collected with the experience and the knowledge of the people that are working in the schools. And one powerful way to do this is in professional learning communities, as we'll talk about a little bit later. If those data are turned into knowledge, you can actually use it for improvement. And this is actually a quite difficult step. We always thought, well, once you've done the data analysis, interpretation, the whole sense-making process, this is where it becomes more easy, because this is where you also rely heavily on the experience of, for example, teachers. But it's not very easy, because the data will never tell you what to do exactly. The data can tell you that your students are struggling with percentages. But what are you going to do? Are you going to simply reteach? Are you going to use different materials? Are you going to group students differently? So this is actually a challenging step. However, if you go through all these steps, there is more and more evidence out there that it can really lead to improved quality of teaching and learning. Unfortunately, you also see if it's not used in the right manner, there can also be unintended effects, such as strategic use, symbolic use, only, for example, because the inspectorate wants it, misuse because of a lack of data literacy, that people make mistakes in the data analysis and interpretation, and then you see that it can lead to an increase in inequality and higher achievement gaps, study delay, and dropout. And I already said it, data literacy is very much needed to be able to use data in such a manner that it does lead to improved quality. I'm hoping that I did not lose any people here. I promise that it will become more practical. That was a little bit of theory that I did that we did think it was important to show, but I'm going to make it a little bit more practical now, because those were the more abstract steps of a data use cycle. And what we did is we took those steps and made it very practical in the form of the data team intervention. Now, what is the data team intervention? A data team intervention is where teams, professional learning communities, consisting of teachers and school leaders, and sometimes even students these days, that work together on an educational problem that they choose. So they start with a goal that they want to work on. We have two main goals with the data team intervention. The first is professional development, to work on the data literacy that is required to use data. And of course, we want to solve that specific educational problem. So the other goal is school improvement. And we work with coaches that guide the data teams through this cycle, sometimes in a year, often in 2 years. And I'm going to take you step by step through the 8 steps of the data team intervention. So firstly, we start with problem definition. And we always start with, okay, what is a current problem in your school? So you start with your goals, and are there any goals that you're not achieving at the moment? And then our coaches always say, prove that you have a problem. Because sometimes problems that we think that we have are in reality different than the ones that we have. On many occasions, for example, data teams thought that they had a problem in the 4th grade of secondary education, and it turned out that they had a problem in the 3rd grade of secondary education, or that no problem in that area existed at all. So it's really important to collect data to prove that you have a problem, and also to determine how big the problem is in terms of the gap between the current and desired situation. And on the slide here, you see an example of a very concrete and specific problem definition. So you see the current situation, and we have a lot of failing students, but it's specified how many. And we also have the desired situation in terms of a goal. And of course, we don't want any students to fail, but it also has to be a realistic goal. So sometimes we also work with goals over multiple years, as you can see here. Then the second step is, once you've identified the problem, think about possible causes of this problem. And we do that in different ways. The data team members brainstorm, they ask their colleagues for input, they look into the literature as another form of evidence, because often data teams work on problems that have also been studied by researchers. And it's usually very easy to make a long list of possible problems. But the challenge is more, okay, which one are we going to investigate, and how are we going to formulate it so that it's also concrete and measurable, so that we can actually collect data on it. So our possible causes really determine the data that we collect. And sometimes we collect data for hypotheses, and then it's quantitative data. So for example, surveys or student achievement results. But sometimes we also collect qualitative data when we have more open questions. And it could be, for example, classroom observations. It could be interviews with students. It could be interviews with teachers. But step 2, the possible causes determine the data that we collect in step 3. We already talked about garbage in, garbage out, the quality of the data. So it's really important that before you turn to the analysis of the collected data, to check the quality of the data. Unfortunately, over the years, we've discovered that there are a lot of low quality data available in schools. For example, surveys that have been administered year after year. But when you look at the questions very carefully, it turns out that the questions are not formulated very concretely. Often there's missing data, and even data that are in our data systems. A dot or a comma makes a big difference. 11 on a scale from 1 to 10 is also an input error. So it's always important to check the quality. And we check the quality in terms of reliability and validity, but we don't do any complicated analysis for reliability and validity. We've developed a checklist to discuss amongst the data team members how the quality of the data is that is collected. And I am going to hand over to my colleague Cindy now to talk about the final steps of the data team intervention.
Yes, thank you so much, Kim. Hi, everyone from the Netherlands. It's really wonderful that you are all here from so many countries. Thanks for joining us. So I'm going to continue with step 5. And as Kim already explained, after you have identified the problem, after you considered the causes in the hypothesis or a research question, and then collected the data about it and checked the quality, as Kim explained in the theory of action, you have to turn that into information and knowledge. And this is what step 5 and step 6 are about. So first, the data analysis. When we're talking about a question in step 2, we're talking about qualitative data analysis. For example, maybe you have done interviews to find out more about the causes. Maybe you have done open observations. Maybe you have analyzed documents. And that's about qualitative analysis. And then quantitative analysis can be very basic frequency, percentages analyses, or it can also be about the mean and maybe the standard deviation, and more complicated analysis that are more statistical, like comparing different groups with a t-test, for example. We have noticed in our data team work and our research before that sometimes people are not so confident in doing these analyses or don't have that much experience yet. And for this reason, we have developed an extra data analysis course to tackle these analyses. So they can be qualitative and quantitative, and they're really about summarizing the information from the data to answer that hypothesis, to be able to accept or reject it, or to answer the research question. And then in the next step, it's really about the conclusion. So it's really about what we considered in step 2 to be the cause or the question that we have into the cause. Can we reject that or confirm it or gain more insight into it? And then it becomes a little bit like a board game. If you reject the hypothesis, you go back to step 2. I usually like to formulate it more like you continue with step 2 with a new hypothesis. Sounds a little bit more optimistic. But of course, it can also happen that you finally know what the cause is and that you can continue with step 7, which is about taking actions. And at a certain point in our research, we had taken stock of all the hypotheses that had been investigated by the teams in a certain period. And they were 78 hypotheses in total, and 33 hypotheses could be accepted so that those teams could continue with the next step of taking action. And in total, in those same processes, of course, 45 had been rejected. And you need to think about that usually in the beginning, more external hypotheses are investigated. Maybe sometimes in secondary schools, it happens that people think, oh, the primary school is to blame, and the students from a certain primary school cannot follow up in secondary school. Or it can happen that the background of the students, or that it's boys versus girls. And we often saw that those types of more external hypotheses were rejected. And hypotheses that were more about things that were going on in the school that we can also actually control were usually more accepted. Sometimes it was also the case that we couldn't really continue with quantitative hypotheses. And that really the question was, what is actually going on? We need to go deeper into this in a more qualitative way. So in some cases, it's also followed up with a more qualitative question. And then it's more about the how or the why. For example, why do students in a certain grade fail a certain subject? If the conclusion is positive about what the cause is or what is going on and provides that insight, then we are going to step 7. That's about taking action. And as Kim already explained, it's a difficult step, but it's not only a difficult step because the data itself and the conclusion itself doesn't specifically tell you what to do. It's also because the teams are now used to investigating and considering and reflecting. And all this time they wanted to be in the mode of doing. And the data team work is asking them to reflect and to think and to consider and to further investigate. And now finally, they know what the cause is about. They have more insight. And then they need to switch the button again to doing. And it's a bit scary. All of a sudden, some people think, don't we need to investigate further? Don't we need to know more? But at some point, we can actually draw conclusions and implement action measures. And because the data don't tell you what to do specifically, you need to think of a way of making that concrete. And one way of making that concrete is, again, to formulate SMART goals, to really divide the task concretely. So who is going to do what and when? But also the question is, of course, where do you start? So students can give input into that in what they need. But for example, also best practices or professional papers, conferences, maybe education conference can give you insights into what you can do to improve the situation. And at the same time, it's also again about collecting data, because you do need to monitor then what is going to happen with the problem situation that you identified. So you also have to think about how are we going to collect data about that, and when are we going to draw conclusions, and how and when are we going to adapt. And then the circle is round again with the final step of evaluating. And it's very important to be mindful of the fact that we're talking about evaluating the process and the effects. And so here first we are talking about the process, because of course we can only conclude that our action measures have helped or have contributed to solving the problem if we know we have actually implemented them in the way we wanted, and if everyone who was supposed to implement them did that. And an example that we always use to show this is, for example, we were working with a team where they found out that the reason that students had a problem with mathematics was specifically because they had forgotten a lot about percentages and fractions. So they get this in primary school at a certain point, and then it's not really repeated anymore until secondary school. And in secondary school, they need it as basic skills for mathematics. And this team found out that more repetition of this was needed because students didn't master that skill anymore. And so they decided as an action measure to do a repetition of percentages every lesson at the beginning of the lesson. So every lesson started with that. And it might have been good to follow up and to do this repetition, but to do it every lesson made the students think, oh, not again. And they actually started to test percentages and found it boring. So the team found this out by doing this monitoring, and they adjusted the measures, and they said, okay, maybe that was a bit of overkill, and now we're just doing it once a week. We do need to keep repeating it. We need to keep paying attention to it, but once a week is a lot better. And this is how they continued. So that's a very simple example to show that you need to consider this. And then when you know about this, and possibly when you've adapted also with input from the students, you can look at the effects. And the question here is actually very simple. The question is, has the problem been solved? And did we reach our goal as we formulated it very concretely and in a measurable way in step 1? So did our actions, for example, our measures result in increased mathematics achievement in the way we specified it in our goal? So also there, be concrete and really show how you are doing that and how you're drawing this conclusion. And here we also notice that sometimes schools have gone up to step 6 or 7, and then somehow they forget a little bit about the evaluation and they go on to a new problem because they're so enthusiastic about the way of working. But I really want to encourage schools who are doing this, who are working with data, to also close that circle and see, okay, all the effort and energy that you put into this process, did it actually help you, or do you need to adjust anything? And then continue, if you like, with a new problem or issue. So this was to conclude the steps and to show how we turn that theory into theory of action into concrete steps. And then I would like to continue with the research and say a little bit more about what we found out in terms of the process and the effects of this intervention before Kim is taking over again and zooming into leadership in the respect of the data use intervention. So many people have contributed to this work as researchers, as coaches, as people supporting us. And this means that in all together, we did 16 years of data teams research. And I could really talk about this for hours. And I love to talk about it for hours. But of course, I have to be brief here and summarize it. But most of our papers are available online. And there's a slide with the references at the end. So let's zoom into just a couple of things before Kim is going to zoom in even further into leadership. So one of our first papers is about the functioning of data teams. And here we really looked into how is this process going. So using observations, being there in some of the meetings and interviewing people, we looked into what can we see in terms of the functioning of these data teams. And here we noticed a couple of things that stood out. For example, how difficult it is to formulate a measurable hypothesis. So people very easily say things like, oh, the cause is this. I am sure that it's about boys versus girls, or that it's about a certain aspect of a subject, or that it's about our teaching, or that it's about the background of the students. And then you ask, okay, so how can we formulate that in a measurable way? Are we going to use grades? Are we going to use frequencies? Are we going to use percentages? And then what will the percentage or the frequency be that's in the hypothesis? So that's something that really needed a lot of coaching. As I already said, with the step of analysis and the rejections of the first hypothesis, the first hypothesis in the teams were often had to be rejected because they were more, well, not because they were more external and more away from what is actually going on in the classroom and what's going on in the teaching. And sometimes schools ask us, why don't you just tell everyone? Why don't you just tell everyone, you know, this hypothesis, we already know that this is probably not the case. So then you can be quicker. But it's not about being quick necessarily. It's also about collaboration. It's also about learning how to use data. And it often feels a lot safer to think about external hypotheses, for example, as first hypothesis, and to learn how to work with the procedure. And at the same time, if you really think in your school that certain causes are going on, it's really powerful to investigate that and then to find out what is really going on, whether that's the case or whether it's contradicted. And this was really an eye-opener for many schools. We have, of course, we help schools also with thinking about the literature, about what is known about learning. So we do also give that information, but we are not going to forbid schools to look into certain hypotheses, unless they are unethical, of course. So really we saw in these teams that it's moving from more external to internal attribution, meaning things going on outside the school that we can also not do a lot about, to inside the school that we can do something about. And very often we saw that those are also the causes that were finally accepted in the hypothesis or that were confirmed in the research questions. And what's really important here is that the collaboration and the dialogue. So the dialogue among the team members talking to each other, but in a safe environment with help of coaches, for example, to find out what's really going on. We also wanted to look into the effects of different levels. And here we really need a kind of a framework for how to do that. Ideally, it would be wonderful if we could have two large groups of schools and follow them for multiple years and have experimental and control groups. However, in reality, it's very important also that schools can choose their own problem to work on. And in reality, we usually had smaller sets of schools that we could study in depth at different levels. And so we needed a line of reasoning to build our evidence. And this line of reasoning is based on models of professional development, for example, from Kirkpatrick, Guskey, I think quite well known. And the line of reasoning is if we, in the end, expect student achievement to increase with such an intervention, we need to know also that teachers have actually used the knowledge and skills that they learned in this intervention, that they indeed learned them, and that they are also that they have a positive attitude to this learning. So this is what we use to build our evidence in different sets of studies. And I'll first show a little bit about the satisfaction and the data literacy effects. And this is really summarizing a lot of research and a lot of papers, as I've showed. So the papers are available online. In general, we saw that people are generally satisfied about the intervention and show a more positive attitude. Also, we saw that people can feel that it's a bit slow, especially in the beginning. So in the first couple of months, it can happen that a hypothesis is rejected, the next is also rejected, the next is also rejected. And then after 3 to 4 months, people think, okay, we would actually now like to know what the cause is. And we're already have spent so much time. And you really need to talk about, okay, but before we did this, we were going from problem to action measure. And we didn't know what was going on. And maybe a year later or 2 years later, we only found out that we weren't doing the right thing. So if you're comparing to that, it's not that slow. And it's important to be mindful of that. We also used a data literacy test that we developed very close to the issues in the steps. And that also showed that people progressed on this, even though they didn't study for it. So some effects were, a medium effect was shown there. And then we looked more towards the use and towards the student achievement level, also in different sets of studies. So they all kind of build on each other. And in the use of learning, we found that it's still quite challenging for teams, but that the participants did make a start with applying. And we had the opportunity to then also look for a specific set of schools, and that's the level 4, whether all of these levels were in line with each other and whether those teams also indeed increased their student achievement. And for that set of schools, we found that 5 out of 9 schools indeed solved the problem, that there was a significant increase in student achievement with video effect sizes. And the nice thing is that we have now the opportunity to do some more research into the effects, and there we're using a data use intervention that's also using an active role of students. So we can share that papers about that as well in the near future, and Kim is also going to talk about that a little bit more. So this is the basis of a lot of our research, and now Kim is going to take over again and looking into leadership for data use. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Cindy. So one of the things that we've noticed when we were studying the data teams is that some data teams are more effective than others. And for data team coaches, and I was one myself in the very first pilot, it's very frustrating that you can't seem to get any further with some data teams while others are really going very well. But as a researcher, it's very interesting to figure out what is going on there and which factors enable and hinder the work of data teams. We found several enablers and barriers for data teams, but one of the most important factors for effective data teams is leadership. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit further, because we really try to discover, okay, what leadership aspects are important for effective data teams. And we found the following 5 building blocks for effective leadership. And I don't know how many of you here are familiar with several leadership theories, but you will recognize a lot of these building blocks from several well-known leadership theories, for example, by Kenneth Leetwood. The first one is vision, norms, and goals, providing individualized support, intellectual stimulation, networking, and creating a climate for data use. So those are the 5 main building blocks, but each of these building blocks consist of several strategies that we found in our more effective data teams. And we try to summarize them on this slide. So what we found is that more effective data teams, there the school had a very clear vision and very clear goals, and they also had ideas on what to do with data use, and data teams. They clearly communicated about their vision. They provided the norms and the structure and the expectations. So these were schools where teachers were expected to use data. And what was also very interesting is that school leaders in these schools not only thought about data teams as a one-year project or a two-year project, but they really thought about how do we integrate data use in our school as a sort of organizational routine, which also meant that they prioritized the work of the data teams. What we sometimes saw with the ineffective data teams is that year one, the data team got started. They were really enthusiastically working in their data team. And then all of a sudden, there was a lot of policy emphasis on digital skills or basic skills. And then the data team got reassigned to do something else without actually making that link that you could actually use data teams to work on basic skills or digital literacy. What we also saw is that effective leaders really provided support to the data team members. They gave them time, so it was facilitated. The data team meetings were in the rosters of the teachers. They provided structures for collaboration, also emotional support. It can at times be quite scary to work on a certain problem related to your own subject and see that a lot of your students are underperforming, and that the reasons for that might have to do with the quality of your instruction. And it's sometimes something that you need to be aware of, and that teachers also need support in, and also a bit of coaching and feedback. What we also saw in that most of the effective data teams, school leaders were actually part of the data team. And what I found really interesting was that leadership was really distributed in the data team. Sometimes when I would visit a data team, I would not be able to tell who's the school leader and who's the teacher, because they were all working together. Also very important is that school leaders are role models and use data themselves. I never forget, in one of the less effective data team schools, it was an important decision that the school had to take in terms of repetition policy, and the school leader implemented a big policy change without using data, and it was even a change that actually contradicted the findings of the data team. So that did not really help. It's also important to encourage teachers to challenge their beliefs. So why do you believe this? Show me the proof for this. And then it's always a little bit of a balance between how much autonomy you give a data team, because teachers do need some autonomy to take decisions based on data, but some teams also need a little bit more steering. And then networking is also very important. What we see is that data teams, they're part of the organization. They develop new knowledge, and that knowledge has to spread throughout the organization. So you need school leaders, but also the teachers in the data team to broker that knowledge, to make sure that that knowledge gets shared with other colleagues. And school leaders also used their network to create commitment. For example, support from a school board or school district when we talk about data teams in the US. And also connect the data team to the wider community. And finally, we found the climate for data use very important. So school leaders that were more effective really focused on data use for improvement. They made sure that there was trust and safety and respect. They stimulated collaboration. And what was interesting here is that they stimulated collaboration within teams and within departments, but also across teams and across departments, also related to the importance of networking and sharing knowledge. I already said the equal collaboration, especially where school leaders are part of the data team, they really collaborated in an equal manner. And finally, they avoided shaming and blaming. One of my worst experiences as a data team coach and researcher was a data team that I guided myself. And then the school leader actually said to the teacher, I would be so ashamed if my numbers were so low. That really did not work very well. So these are all the building blocks that we found summarized. There's a lot more to tell. We've published also articles on this, which we would be happy to share. What is important to mention is that all the building blocks, of course, are related to each other. And when I talk about school leaders and leadership, it's important to acknowledge that there are formal and informal leadership roles. I talked a little bit about distributed leadership. So when you look at these different building blocks, it's important to see who needs to be able to do that. For example, when it comes to facilitating time, then it's the official school leader, the principal, or the team leader who can only do that. But when it comes to being a role model, when it comes to data use, other teachers can also be that role model. So different actors can work collaboratively on these different building blocks. And together is what we found is that they can create more effective data teams that actually improve education. So getting to the end of our presentation so that we have a little bit time left for some questions. I know it was a lot of information. So if there are only 3 things that you can take away is start with a purpose and not with data, use multiple sources of data, and effective data use requires distributed leadership. Now, on the latter, Cindy already mentioned it. One of the new studies that we are engaging in at the moment is what happens if we include students as data users, and also the type of leadership that is required if you want to include students in the use of data. Unfortunately, we don't have time to present about this. That would be another hour. But we are very excited to announce here that our first paper for this new study has just been published and it's open access available. So I will post it in the chat and then I think we can stop presenting so we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much. Well, maybe we can keep it in mind to, in a not so long future to have another webinar in another course, maybe about involving students.
Happy to talk about that.
Always happy.
Perfect. Yeah, we also touched upon it a bit in this online course because we had from Denmark some teacher trainers who did some activities with students, like doing research on mobile phone use in schools. Thank you very much. It's also very impressive to see that for something so complex like data use in schools, you could see some impact on achievement of students as well in some of the schools. I'm looking at the chat and I don't see any questions there yet, but we had already asked participants to send us their questions, so we could also maybe start from there. Let me quickly check what we had. So, yeah, there was a question about artificial intelligence. I think you've done research into this as well. So they were asking if decisions made by artificial intelligence could be used or could be trusted. Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
I think that's a very important question, but there are a lot of AI tools available, so it depends a little bit on the tool that you're actually using. But I think transparency is a very important ethical principle when it comes to AI. So if you want to use an AI tool for decision making, you have to make sure that it's a transparent tool, that you can check what kinds of data have been used in the AI tool, how likely is it that there's bias in there. There's always bias in any AI, but there's also bias in human and in data. So these are all kinds of things that you need to verify before you actually trust the AI. And it's always important to evaluate critically, but it's also important to evaluate your data critically. So if you use an AI tool, I would recommend to really check what kind of tool it is. And also, I'm hoping that most people are not thinking about uploading their own private data sets in any AI tools. I know it's tempting because it can analyze your data very quickly, but you don't want to have your data available online. So there are all kinds of questions that are important. For the people that are interested in that, I think we talked about data literacy, but one of the research projects that I'm running at the moment is about AI literacy and the competencies that people need to be able to use AI for decision making. And we are finalizing the first paper on AI literacy and the indicators. So feel free to send me an email and I would be happy to share that before the summer when it comes out.
Another question is, how can schools strike a balance between using data for accountability and ensuring that data use supports inclusive student-centered learning?
It's
Yes.
a question that we get a lot. And I think that, well, as we talked about, the accountability is really important. And what we see in most schools that we work with is that accountability can be a really nice starting point for data use. But in most systems that we've worked with, the data from those external evaluation and from the accountability system doesn't give you enough actionable insights to actually improve your school upon, but it can point to certain problem areas, and then you can follow up with local school data to find out causes of the problem and really engage in that school improvement process. So that's what we usually find helpful.
I also really liked the question I will put now in the chat, Antoine, if I may, because I thought that was a really important question and we didn't really highlight it in the steps that much. It's about how can schools use data ethically and not only support struggling students, but also ensure we're not unintentionally fostering learned helplessness, which I think is very important. We are now working also, so the new projects are also about student voice and actively involving students. We have a student working on empowerment also. That's not in data use, but the student voice and student empowerment is really now an issue. I think what's important to say here, it's also important not only to look at data and combine it with your experience, but also look in the literature, what is known about how students learn and how you can support their learning in a way that also takes into account their self-regulatedness, their voice, and their empowerment. So on the one hand, we know we cannot throw students into the deep right away, even though they are 15 or 16 years old, or maybe especially because they are 15 or 16 years old. At the same time, we know from the literature strategies and tactics that we can use to foster their self-regulated learning, to foster their metacognitive abilities. So, and for any subject really, it's also important to use what is known from the literature about student learning, depending on the problem that you identified and the causes of that problem. I really want to stress that as well.
Thank you for bringing this question up as well, Cindy. I'm also curious if when you were working with schools, were there any schools that were trying to address maybe disadvantaged students in their problem? Maybe it did not exist as much. Like I read, for example, from that now, I think that addressing equity is not that common in data use in schools, but maybe you have an example of it.
It's coming up a little bit more. More well-being, bullying, things like that. To my knowledge, not so much the specific topics you're mentioning.
Not as a goal per se. I do remember, Cindy, from our project in Sweden, that we had one school that was in a disadvantaged area, and they scored very low on the national assessment. And their hypothesis was because of their environment and that they were in a disadvantaged area. But what was very interesting is that they then went to another school in the same neighborhood, thinking, okay, they serve the same type of student population, so their national assessment results will also be low. But that school was actually doing really well, so they could not blame it anymore on the student population. But it wasn't that the goal was equity. It was just they had a lot of underperforming students, and they wanted to change that.
It is very important to stress that we're not only talking about students' achievements. So well-being, things like bullying, student satisfaction can also really be issues that data teams investigate. I also see a question here about how going from implementing an effective action measure to school-wide improvement. That's a very good question. Again, I have to say something we could talk about for an hour. There was also research by one of our PhDs into brokering and sharing knowledge. And it has to do with leadership as well. So the things that Kim explained, distributed leadership, making sure you communicate from the beginning of the data team and not at the end. Look what we found. We've been quiet for a year and this is what we found, but really from the beginning, getting input. And data can also be interviews with colleague teachers, can be interviews with students that you use to also spread in the school the thinking. And it shouldn't only be about findings. It should also be about questions that you have to gather. It should also be about the process. It should also be about the organization, and be mindful of that from the beginning. That's the short answer, and we would have a long answer in papers and another webinar. But it's important. It's a good question indeed.
I'll take note of that. I also see a question about whether your projects on data teams will go beyond European schools, so Asia and Africa, for example. Maybe you've done it already, I'm not sure, but...
I've just answered it. So far, we've done project mostly in the West, in Sweden, Belgium, the US, but we've just started a new project this year in Singapore. And we also think that the data team method should be useful in no matter what country you're located in, depending on whether you have data. But I think we did a special issue, Cindy and myself, with Pasi Salberg a couple of years ago, where we studied data use in developing countries. And any school in any country has data available. So.
Do you have a few more minutes to take
Actually, there are some more questions. There was also a question about the slides, whether we can.
And I unfortunately have to pick up my son from after school care, but I'm sure that Cindy can answer all the follow-up questions. And
I can stay for a couple of more minutes.
We can share the slides, and also feel free to send me an email. The people here, if they have any questions, happy to answer any questions via email as well.
Thank you very much, Kim.
It's my pleasure.
Sorry. I hope it didn't take you too long.
No, that's okay. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I also see a question about the validation of the effectiveness of. I'm not sure what you mean with the question. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit while we also look into.
Yeah, I'm not sure what is meant by validation there as well.
If it's about the effectiveness itself, I think I already explained it would have been it would be great if we could do experimental or even quasi-experimental research into this. An important issue there is that we often in the Netherlands nobody wants to be in a control group. We have done experimental studies with other interventions where it's quite challenging, but of course that's not a reason not to do it or not to try. But the main one of the main starting points is that schools work on their own problem. So we hardly have comparable groups. If they all look into a different problem, then it's difficult to kind of compare the results among groups with each other. But we are looking into and hopefully in the future planning to do more with control group or experimental research. But we just have to find common themes among the schools to be able to do that. And it's also not the case that not more schools have solved the problem. There was one study about it. And of course, schools have reported to us, more schools have reported to us, but they weren't part of a scientific study. So that's the scale of the research that we did so far.
Yeah, and I see
yeah, so it would have to be longer term. It would have to be schools focus on the same theme, on the same problem, so that we can actually compare the results, and that we haven't been able to do that yet. So that would be powerful. And for example, if they would all focus on basic skills, which is now an issue in the Netherlands, like reading and arithmetic, reading mathematics, for example. But at the same time, if it would all be about a certain aspect of well-being, that would also be useful.
Then I have a question, Cindy, because you earlier mentioned, I think, a data course, and also you talked about the checklist as well. Are these things that are open access? Are these resources that we can share with schools? Because then,
do you mean that the test, the data literacy test? So we our research instruments are all in our papers and or can be shared. The manual and the course are now in the they are licensed to consultants who are doing that. They have really been how do you call it? They really know how to work with the procedure. They have studied it as well. They have we have a lot of cooperation with them. So that cannot be shared unless it's for research purposes. But I would have to link you to them for that.
Okay, thank you. It could be interesting for schools who want to try a data team approach, but maybe don't have a data coach, have access to a data coach. Maybe some self-studying material could be interesting.
Well, if people are interested, of course, we can always talk about it, but it's good to know that the materials, a certain part of the materials can be shared for research purposes, and it really depends on the rest of the conditions, what we can do there. And the papers are all freely available. There's a book about the data team procedure in English, in Dutch, in Swedish. So there is a lot of information out there already that you can use to start with.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Then I think that's it with the questions in the chat as well, right? Yeah, I think we addressed all of them.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us. And thanks again. Thank you very much, Cindy, for making time for this, and to Kim as well.
Welcome.
We will share the slides through the course. We can also send it to the people registered to the webinar in advance. And the recording of the webinar will also be available in the course. For those of you who are teachers, we very much hope that you will share these insights with your colleagues and the school leadership as well. Please take a look at the Agile EDU MOOC as well, which also has references to the data team model. And with this, I say a good evening to you, and hope to see you another time.
See you, everyone. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.